He hung up without meaning to. The phone was still warm in his hand when Henrique found himself staring at the living room the way someone stares at a painting they've owned for years but never really looked at. The house was exactly as it had been the week before, the month before, the year before. Curtains drawn, the heavy desk lamp burning even in daylight, a single white mug crusted with old coffee on the corner of the side table. The air had its own kind of stillness, not quiet but practiced, an absence of anyone who might rearrange things, move them, change the pattern of dust. Her daughter called? Renato's text blinked on his screen, short, businesslike. Henrique hadn't answered. He was measuring the short silence after the call, like one might measure a room before deciding where to place a chair. The voice had been small when it came over the line, not frightened, steady in the way that people who live on muscle and second shifts get steady, but thin, a strip of courage. Mr. Henrique, my mother, Maria, she had a stroke. I can't leave her alone. I can come in to clean until she's better. She's always cleaned for you. I'm Julia. I'll do it for the same hours. It should have been a polite decline. He should have said the right thing. Someone will come by, arrangements will be made, we'll cover her salary. But Henrique did something else. He said yes. It was not a decision born of generosity. It was a decision made of habit and a calendar. The cleaner's spot in his household had been part of the clockwork of his life. The person who kept the house running had always been a piece of the infrastructure he didn't have to think about, until someone called to tell him that piece had broken and a hand reached for the tools. The next morning, a key turned in the front lock before the sun had sharpened the city. Henrique watched from the second-floor landing as a small figure moved across the foyer, one shoulder bared beneath a thin jacket, hair braided low, a canvas bag that held more grit than comfort. She looked like anyone he might pass on the street at noon, busy hands, shoes blurred at the toes, not a trace of expecting spectacle. She carried herself the way people who have learned to make themselves small in public do. She kept her head down and let the house take the full weight of its silence. She left a note on the marble counter. He saw it later when he joined the dining room, another habit, another circuit he moved through. The note was not the polished communication he would have expected from anyone else who entered his private sphere. It was a folded page, edges slightly crumpled, written in a hand that was impatient with formality. Mr. Henrique, I'm Julia. My mother had a stroke. I came to clean. I will not take money beyond the hours. I will be here 8 and 2. If you need anything, leave a note. J. It was the simplest of sentences. It could have been a business card and a contract at once. Inside the house, the small differences rippled out slowly. Julia had a way of moving her hands when she worked, precise, as if she were arranging not only objects but the space they held in one another. She began in places no one would deem urgent, the photograph on the mantel with its glass clouded by dust, the stilted cushion that never quite sat right. She wiped the grime from the frame, turned the picture upright when she noticed it had been face down for some time, and set the photograph so it caught the light that came from somewhere deeper than the blinds. Light mattered to her. She pushed a fingertip along the seam of the curtain, found the fastening, and drew the fabric apart like someone pulling a curtain back on a different day. The room breathed. Sunlight hit a spine of books and turned their edges into gold. The stale smell of mildew and old coffee unclenched into something softer, lemon cleaner, and the faint sweetness of the bread she had tied in a cloth and left in the pantry for when she felt aloud. Henrique noticed all of it the way someone notices the first chord of a song after listening to the radio for months. Subtle, immediate, disarming. He noticed the smell before he saw the woman. The air in the house tasted like the rest of the world had been let in. He noticed the absence of the mug on the table, the stack of papers aligned at right angles, the way the lamp was dimmed and not left to burn like an emergency beacon. He found himself in the kitchen, hands folded behind his back, watching her as if from across a glass. He could have cleared his throat and introduced himself properly, could have demanded an explanation, but there was a quiet that made those gestures feel unnecessary. She moved with an economy he recognized from routines he'd been trained in since childhood, ions of motion that implied survival and competence in equal measure. "Good morning," he said finally, the words finding their place like a key in a lock. He had not meant them to sound like an invitation. She turned. For a moment he saw the lines at the corner of her eyes, the precise way her mouth moved when she measured a phrase. Up close, her hands were rough with work, but not clumsy. If anything, there was a clarity in them that made him feel suddenly uncertain about the mass of his own hands that had only ever handled glass and paper. "Good morning, Mr. Henrique," she answered, straightening. Her voice belonged to someone who had practiced politeness until it fit the inside of her chest. "The infirmary called. They said they could keep Donna Maria overnight if it helps. I promised I'd come in today so we don't miss anything." Henrique's first reaction was awkwardness, the sort that visits in the thin moment between a change of plan and implementation. He tried to fit the situation into brackets he understood, someone covering a shift. He should have asked where his cleaner had been rushed, what the prognosis was. He did not. He asked instead how she had come to have the key. "My mother gave it to me," she said. "She told me to keep order. That's what I've always done." There was the faintest of smiles, the kind people keep for public transactions, and Henrique felt it as if someone had nudged a wall in his life and found it hollow. He noticed a photograph propped against a stack of unopened correspondence on his desk. The face meant to be at the center of the house had been placed aside. It was a portrait of a woman he had spoken to on holidays and business dinners, but never had his feet beside at the breakfast table. Her expression in the photo was candid and absent the guardedness he kept for guests. Julia reached for the frame and turned it to face outward, then set it where sunlight could touch it. There was a small, almost unnameable thing that happened then. The mansion, which had been a practiced theater of order, felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a place where someone lived. It was not an immediate warmth, no sudden flood of tenderness, but it was the recognition that there had been a forgetting, not malicious, but habitual. A house could go on being a house while the people inside it moved around like ghosts. He watched her clean the study, the care so methodical it bordered on ritual. She sorted the papers on his desk with the abstract patience of someone who had balanced registers and grocery lists all her life. Bills were stacked by month, envelopes slotted by sender, a pile of unopened mail transformed into a readable order. She found, tucked beneath the ledger, a brittle receipt for a subscription he hadn't used in years and placed it gently in the bin, as if erasing a small piece of habit that had stayed longer than its welcome. He should have been ashamed of noticing these things. His company taught him to analyze, to optimize, to see the efficiency in systems. That day, he felt a different kind of assessment, a growing awareness of what he had accepted as normal because he never had reason to question it. She had not reorganized with judgment or disdain. It was not meant as a rebuke, more like a quiet repair. When she paused at the window and opened it wider, the sound of the city came in as an intrusion, both startling and enlivening. A man in a distant street vendor's stall called out orders. A bus hissed past. The world was busy with its ordinary mess, and inside Henrique's house, a strip of sunlight fell across the parquet and gleamed like an offering. He found himself moving through the rooms to check on her as if he were inspecting a hireling, and in doing so he discovered the absurdity of his position. A 48-year-old man, used to being the center of contracts and calculations, feeling watched by the humble order a stranger brought to objects he had long considered furniture. "Do you need any special instructions?" he asked, feeling suddenly like a man asking for directions. She looked at him with a steadiness he had not expected. "Only that, if there's anything fragile, tell me where it goes," she said. "I don't want to break what matters." He thought of the photographs again, how she had set them right. "Why would you do that?" he asked before he could stop himself. She shrugged, a practical motion that dismissed sentiment as insufficient explanation. "Because someone once paid attention to me when I was small. My mother taught me to put things where they belong. It keeps the people who live there from being lost." Her answer was not sentimental. It was simple and precise. It landed on him like a statement of fact. When she left that afternoon, she folded the apron neatly and set it beside the sink. She had left the curtains open. She had replaced the lamp's bulb with something softer. On the counter, next to the same folded note, she added another small page with a list of what she had done. Washed kitchen towels, fixed the latching on the back door, sorted the study drawers. It read like a ledger and like a promise. If the first morning was an incision that let light into a room, the second day tightened the new color into a pattern. Henrique found scraps of kindness tucked into corners as if the house itself had learned to speak. A cloth left warmed on the railing. A packet of tea set beside his briefcase. When he opened the study door one morning, he caught sight of her silhouette through the frosted glass. She was humming, soft, almost embarrassment at the sound of her own voice, and aligning his books by size rather than subject. A small, unnecessary act that made the shelves look like a carefully staged memory. There were things she did that were not in any instruction manual. She walked around photographs, noticed a smudge on a portrait that had been there since the house was new, and cleaned until the face in the frame looked like someone who might speak back. She rearranged the cushions on the sofa so the room looked less staged and more lived in, and she made a point of setting a small basket of fresh fruit on the kitchen counter. For Henrique, who had long ago delegated the smell of fresh bread and the feel of a place being used to others, the basket was a small accusation. He began to leave his office earlier than usual, not enough to cause alarm, not to change anything about his calendar, but enough to be present when she returned from whatever small errand she had taken. They exchanged small practical phrases at the kitchen counter, when the wash was free, where to dispose of a broken glass, and through those exchanges a fragile familiarity formed, the kind that does not require much explanation. Outside the house, in the flurry of delivery trucks and suits and the city's business as usual, the changes were nearly invisible. At the supermarket, where Julia worked evenings, the gossip took shape in quieter ways. Colleagues noticed that she came to work smelling faintly of cleaner and lemon, asked whether she had been hired full-time, made small jokes about trading up. Julia laughed at those jokes the way a person laughs with one hand on the register, to keep the sound from changing her face. She had not come to the mansion looking for anything she could not carry out by herself. She had come because the work mattered, because her mother's absence had to be filled. It was the sort of loyalty that made practical demands on her day, not a storybook sacrifice. When customers asked about her mother, she would say, with the precision of someone who deflects sentiment, "She's getting help, don't worry." At night, after the supermarket closed, she sat with her books spread on her small kitchen table, administration, accounting, dreaming of a way to make small businesses run better, imagining in very real and businesslike ways a company that would train cleaners and pay them fairly. She kept her dreams under a lamp that was lower than Henrique's. She wrote notes in the margins of a battered notebook, plans for pricing, a list of partners in the neighborhood, a sketch of a logo that read Recomeço in block letters. The name had come to her in a moment between shifts, something about a new beginning that was not a rescue but a restart. The notebook was full of figures, dates, and names she would need to call when the first payday came. Henrique felt his chest tighten the evening he saw the notebook peeking from her canvas bag as she bent to tie her shoe on the porch. He noticed the fraying at the heel of her sneaker, the way the thread caught on the concrete lip. She had the sort of hands that earned their calluses honestly. He felt something like guilt and something like respect. He told himself neither should matter. It did not stop him from doing what he did next. He left a small loaf of bread on the kitchen counter the following morning. It was an instinct, not a strategy. He had bought the loaf from the cafe he stopped by on his way to work for years, the one with a woman who saved him a table when he forgot his reservations. He left it beside a note that could have been meant for anyone or for no one. "Thought you might like this. Use the washer any time. H." When Julia found it, she did not squeal or collapse. She stood, holding the bread like she was balancing a fragile idea. She read the scrawl, the initial, and felt the weight of implication. It could be charity, it could be kindness. It could be an opening or an intrusion. She had learned to evaluate such things quickly. She set the bread in the pantry, wrapped it again in the cloth from her bag, and placed her hand over it for a moment as if to reassure herself that she had agency over what she would do next. She did not take the money he had left on his first day. He hadn't left any. She would not have accepted it anyway. Instead, she wrote a small line on the page of her own notebook, a single clause in the ledger of her life. If help is offered, set terms. It was a rule she had learned early. Dignity was a set of boundaries as much as it was a posture or a smile. That afternoon, when she returned from the laundromat, after washing the hospital linens her mother's ward had sent home, she found Henrique in the study doorway. He had not been there before she left. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his suit, an old habit of his, as if he were checking whether his body still fit the shape of command. There was a moment of embarrassment when she realized she was still in her supermarket uniform, an apron with the logo smudged at the hem, but she did not apologize for her appearance. There was no need. The house now accepted her as an order, not a spectacle. "You're here early," she said. The sentence was a statement not of surprise, but of observation. He nodded. He stopped, the script of his daily responses folding inward as if the house had demanded something he had not prepared to give. "Thank you. You did good work." She inclined her head, not because he had offered the compliment, but because she acknowledged being seen. For the first time since she had pressed the key into the lock, she felt she was not merely filling a hole in someone else's schedule. She was making an imprint on an order that had been taken for granted. That recognition was not flattering or humiliating. It was plain and practical and quietly powerful. He left before sunset that day with the feeling that he had been startled by a living thing in his house and that the shock had done something to him. He could not name it. He only knew that each thing she removed and replaced made the house smaller in its arrogance and larger in its invitation to live. When he returned that evening, after meetings where men with crisp collars spoke as if the world bent at the angle of their will, he paused in the hall and smelled lemon. The scent threaded through the air like a promise he had not been asked to keep. He thought of his appointments and felt them brittle and removable. For a moment he's imagined taking Eric's place at a small desk, reducing his days to a sequence of true things: bread, clean sheets, the careful tending of a photograph. It was a dangerous thought, impractical, silly, but it was true. He sat at the kitchen table and took out a pen. He wrote nothing about investments or shares. He did not outline budgets or propose hires. He wrote a line he had not used since his mother's funeral. "We must take care of the people who make life possible." The line felt like a personal admission. He folded the paper and left it beside the loaf of bread, not as a gift, but as a proposition, a small opening into a larger conversation if she wanted it. She found the paper when she returned from the cemetery where she had gone to leave flowers at the small grave of someone who had been like a mentor in the neighborhood. She read the sentence, and the rhythm of her breath changed. It did not mean anything beyond what words can mean on a page, but it carried the weight of intention. She did not respond immediately. She had learned to keep decisions suspended until she could see their edges. That night, she sat with her mother in the bright, angry hospital room while the machines hummed a background of tiny commitments. Donna Maria's hand clenched the blanket. She had always been a woman of steady faith, the sort who said, "Thank God," as a way of performing gratitude, not to invoke miracles. Julia held her mother's hand, feeling the skin thin like paper. It was not a scene for grand promises. It was work. It was care. When she left the hospital, the city dared to be warm in the way the streetlights pooled into the puddles. She paused at a corner kiosk and bought a single candle, lighting it with an economy of motion that made the flame look like a private vow. She walked home with the candle close to her chest, thinking of the house where she had set photographs right and opened curtains wide. She thought of the small rules she had written in her notebook, and the way Henrique's paper lay folded in a place that would not intrude upon her choices. Back in the mansion, Henrique sat in the study until midnight, arranging nothing at all. He had a habit of staying when his days needed to expand beyond practicalities, not because he did surprise inspections, but because he enjoyed the feeling of being the person who could make decisions without asking. That night, there was a new reluctance tied to that power. He had given permission for someone to enter his private space. He found himself worrying over what that might mean. He thought of the way she moved her hands and the list she had left. He thought of the bread he had bought and the paper he had written and the strange embarrassment that came with leaving someone a kindness that might be misread. He debated the practicalities. Was it better to offer immediate help with the mother's hospital expenses? Should he insist on hiring a trained nurse? He did not want to patronize. He did not want to purchase loyalty. He wanted to act in a way that preserved the line between help and interference. Hours later, after the city had folded in on itself and Henrique's clock ticked with the sound of someone who measures days by profit margins, he left a small, considered message. A card with his initials and a line of text. "If you need anything, you have my number." Beneath it, he had written in a hand that was steadier than he felt, "If there's a way to help your mother's recovery, tell me. We'll approach it as a partnership." He meant the word. He did not mean to shame or to buy gratitude. He wanted to offer resources in a way that did not erase the other person. The distinction was important to him in theory, difficult in practice. Julia read the card the next morning in the soft confusion of dawn. She held Henrique's initials in her palm like an invitation and measured its edges. A partnership. The word sat like a tool she might use if she could shape it to fit. She went to the mirror and straightened her braid. She had lessons to finish that weekend, a class on basic bookkeeping that might make the numbers of the business she dreamed of make sense. She had a mother who needed steady care. She had chosen months ago to believe that one's work, cleaning, stacking, fixing, could be more than a job. It could be a foundation. She left a reply on his counter the way she had left the first list, precise, uncluttered. "Mr. Henrique," she wrote, "I will accept professional help for Donna Maria. I will arrange it. I will not take charity. If you wish to help, offer as investment, training for workers, fair pay, and contracts. If you agree, we will make terms. Julia." The handwriting was neat and firm. She placed the paper next to the loaf of bread and the folded card, then sat for a long time with the kettle steaming and no desire to prove anything. The house had, in those few days, become a testing ground for the way people reframe power. Henrique read her reply alone and felt his chest shift. There was, he realized, a small relief in the boundaries she set, an invitation with edges he could respect. He had not expected the neatness of her refusal to accept charity. He had not expected the force of her insistence that help be transactional, professional, dignified. It embarrassed him and steadied him at once. The next morning, Henrique did something that stunned him when he considered it. He put a call on his calendar to speak with a physiotherapy clinic he had used for a knee he had injured years earlier. He did not plan to be visible in the action. He simply wanted the practical, a list of recommended therapists, an estimate. He wanted to know the mechanics of care, how long recovery might take, what training a caregiver might need to support physical therapy in the home. He found, in that small research, the edge of a larger curiosity. He read until he found one clinic with a name he respected and called. The woman who answered the phone booked a first appointment within a week and promised to send an evaluation. Henrique felt the office shift under his feet. He was doing something that required paperwork, a contract, a clear exchange. The action pleased him for its clarity. That afternoon, Julia arrived to find a small envelope on the counter with a clinic's business card and a note. "Initial evaluation scheduled. No cost to you. H." He had not included money. He had included an appointment, a professional pathway, and the language of a contract. It was, for all its smallness, precisely what she had asked for. She held the card between her thumb and forefinger and let the house's lemon scent fill her lungs. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future in which the house was no longer a fortress of dust, but a place where people could be mended with the dignity they deserved. She put the card in her notebook and underneath wrote another tidy clause. Evaluate terms before accepting anything further. She had learned, In the years, she had balanced shifts and nights of study to turn feelings into plans. She could let gratitude be a door without letting it be a chain. That evening, Henrique stood in the doorway while she prepared dinner from a small pan she had taken to keeping in the kitchen. She liked to bring home something that smelled homemade, a small rebellion against the blandness of reheated office food. She offered him a cup of tea without ceremony, and he accepted it because suddenly he wanted the ordinary exchange of warmth instead of the exchange of ideas. "You're building something," he said quietly, more observation than question. She glanced at him and smiled the barest smile. "I have a notebook," she said. "Names, prices, a plan for training. I call it recommesso." He liked the word. It made the room seem less like a place to pass through and more like a place that could start over. He felt a queer kind of joy, not flashy and not public, the pleasure of discovering someone who was steady and driven and not asking for a doorway she could not step through. Outside, the city lit itself up. Inside, two people who came from different orders of life began to negotiate the small terms of being seen. There was no rush to anything more. Neither of them, even in private, named the possibility of romance. They spoke in schedules and plans and lists and appointments because those were the languages they trusted. But there were moments, soft, unguarded, where silence said more than words. Henrique watched her as she folded a dish towel, the motion economical and precise. He found himself imagining her teaching that motion to others, a movement that could spread certainty. Julia felt his attention like a draft. It warmed her in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with being acknowledged. When they reached the threshold where the private began to dance with the practical, neither made a move. There was respect, not for its own sake, but because both had learned the cost of confusing help with possession. The house, for its part, yielded its surface only slowly. Dust did not become memory in a day, and photographs did not begin to speak in full sentences. But they were changing. The curtains were open more than they had been, and the kitchen smelled of lemon and baking, and the desk no longer retained the feeling that it had been waiting. On the morning Julia chose to wash the doormat, she noticed a man standing on the pavement looking up at the house. Henrique had not told anyone she was here. The man, coated, tie-knotted with the ease of someone who belongs to meetings, raised his eyebrows when he saw her. For a half-second, the world arranged itself into an onlooker's question. Did she belong? She simply smiled. A private smallness held like reserve and went on with the broom. The man's look flickered into something else. Surprise, perhaps, or a conjecture that a house of that size might rarely host a worker who walked in from the street without fanfare. He seemed, in his brief assessment, pleased to be entertained. Henrique stepped out then, boots on gravel, and the man straightened as if prepared to assume he should take a bow. He had the habit of doing that at city gates. He expected others to fit into his expectations and was sometimes disappointed when they did not. But the man's expression changed into something like curiosity when Henrique introduced Julia as the person filling in for his cleaner. "Oh," the man said, and in that small sound there was an invisible audience, someone waiting for spectacle. "You're covering for her? She's been with your household a long time." "She is," Henrique said. He felt the urgency of protecting the small contract they had formed, the unspoken understanding that this was a temporary shift, that nothing had changed its terms unless both of them signed it. "She's here to keep things running. She's reliable." The man nodded, as if comportment could be judged by the shape of words. He left, and the moment dissipated like a gust. Julia watched him go and then turned back to her mop. The house accepted the transient noise of other people as it accepted the cleaner's broom, the rhythm of human voices passing through like weather. Henrique watched her and felt in himself, for the first time in years, a real desire to remove the scaffolding that separated other people from his life. He did not know how to say it. He did not know if he wanted to say it aloud. So he did a smaller thing. He took a paper from his desk and set up a small schedule in his calendar, a list of times she would be paid, a line item for supplies, a note to call the physiotherapist for an updated estimate after the evaluation. It was mundane and practical and dignified in equal share. He left the page in the drawer of the desk, where she might find it by accident, and in doing so, surprised himself. He had acted not in the broad sweep of philanthropy, but in the detail of an administrative act, an act of governance that did not claim ownership. It was the shape of his comfort. That evening, the sun dipped behind the city and the house hummed with the quiet contentment of clean rooms. Henrique stood in the hallway and watched as Julia wrapped a bandage around her mother's hand during a brief visit home, moving with the assuredness of someone who had been trained by circumstances and who refused to let them define her completely. She was more than the position she held in anyone's life. She was a person with a notebook and plans and principles. He felt an unfamiliar emotion then, something like admiration braided with fear. He understood he was invested, now not with money, but with attention. And attention, he knew, could be much more dangerous and much more revealing than any bank transfer. Night came down like a curtain, and the house settled into a different kind of hum. The photograph on the mantel finally seemed to breathe as if it had found a place to hold its breath. Henrique heard, from somewhere in the house, the sound of the kettle singing low and unembarrassed. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that the person who had entered his home had done something he had not expected anyone to do. She had made him notice what had been missing. He did not know how the rest of the world would react when they found out. He did not know what Renato would say if he saw the schedule in the drawer, or what the partners would think of a detail-oriented young woman who had organized his desk. He did not know whether other people would interpret his small acts as weakness or kindness. He only knew that one quiet morning, a woman had turned a photograph upright, and the world inside his walls had shifted in consequence. And Julia? She stood at the sink, hands damp, and felt the weight of a choice she had not anticipated when she had first reached for the key. She had come in on a promise to her mother and had not intended to stay beyond the hours she had set, but the house had been kind to the small energies she invested. People had a way of noticing competence and repurposing it into something more demanding. She folded the tea towel, tucked it into the drawer, and wrote a new line at the bottom of her ledger. Keep terms, keep dignity, keep eyes open. Then she looked at the clock, gathered her things, and left, locking the door in the exact way her mother had taught her. Outside, Henrique watched her walk away and felt a sudden, unsteady thing like protectiveness. He told himself he was being foolish, but the feeling lingered like an aftertaste. He folded his hands, the way people fold theirs when they are trying to understand a complicated idea, and considered the idea of partnership, what it meant for someone like him to invest, not to possess, but to enable. The house waited. It had accepted a change and left its protocol for the next day. The city buzzed beyond the gates with its habitual clatter, the kind that makes people forget that the small things in houses can tilt lives. But inside that old mansion, light had been let in, a loaf of bread had been offered and kept, and two people who might otherwise never have shared a page of the same book had begun to write a paragraph together, careful, measured, and urgent. If this beginning moved you, tap like and tell us below. Would you have let her in? Days folded into routine. The rhythm they had invented, her hours, his occasional presence, settled into both of them the way a comfortable sweater fits a body. The house no longer smelled like a warehouse of things. It smelled of lemon and something freshly baked that was not quite grand, but entirely human. The photograph on the mantel faced outward, and when the morning light struck it, the eyes in the portrait looked less like a reminder and more like a companion. Julia kept the notebook in the top drawer of the kitchen under the towel she always folded just so. Recamaso lived there in ink and sketches and budgets, a map of the work she wanted to make possible for other people who cleaned for a living as she did. Training modules, fair hourly rates, a rotation schedule that respected family time, a clause about sick leave. She added notes from her night classes, numbers scribbled between recipes and a list of neighborhood names, people she thought might want to learn, people she trusted. Henrique found himself reading those scribbles by accident the day he opened the drawer for a pen. He did not try to hide that he had. There was something in the precision of her calculations that appealed to him as much as the careful way she folded towels did. It was a practical intelligence like his, deployed on different soil. He began, almost without deciding, to assume a different posture in their exchanges. He asked questions about her projected cash flow, about licensing requirements, about how she would scale while keeping wages fair. Each time she answered, she did so with an economy that let the measures stand on their own. The physiotherapist's evaluation came and went with the professionalism Henrique had promised. Donna Maria's treatment plan was written in clear language. Daily exercises, a schedule for muscle re-education, a recommendation for in-home support during the early weeks. The clinic sent a careful invoice. Henrique requested documentation and a contract model. He paid no theatrics. The money moved like any other contractual item, transparent, traceable, and contingent upon measurable progress. Julia approved every step. She insisted on a written plan for the caregiver she would hire for the nights when she needed to sleep. She interviewed candidates with the same seriousness she used in hiring at the supermarket. Questions about experience, references, whether they cleaned with bleach or with regard for fragile items. When she hired a woman named Rosa, who had worked for years at a municipal home care program, she drew up the first informal contract herself and handed Henrique a copy. "You could have asked me to sign it," he said one evening, reading the little lines she had written. "You asked me to set terms," she answered. "This is a term." She slid the page across the table like an offer. "We need clarity, or we'll only have favors that never end." He signed. The pen felt oddly ceremonial in a way neither of them intended. The signature was not a surrender. It was an agreement. News travels differently when its signal is official. When Henrique placed the Recamaso outline on his desk and asked his assistant to add a preliminary item, training and pilot funding for a neighborhood of cleaning staff, the ripple touched people who moved in other networks. At the office, Mauricio raised an eyebrow over coffee. Renato sent a dry message asking whether this was a hobby or a new line of corporate social responsibility. Their skepticism was not malicious. It was practical. They had built careers on risk assessment. Investments required forecasts and exit strategies. Mentorship programs required oversight. The difference in stakes created friction. You want to expand into a labor initiative? Mauricio asked during a meeting that had been scheduled for supply chain negotiations. His tone was careful but unconcealed. Henrique placed the Recomeso binder on the conference table and let the thin stack of pages speak before he did. "It's a pilot," he said. "Training, certification, a formal payroll for domestic workers. Market research shows demand for a dependable, vetted services." Renato frowned at the spreadsheets. "It's ambitious. Our core competency is logistics and retail. Why allocate capital here? There are reputational risks if this project fails." Henrique met his colleagues' faces the way he had once met hostile markets. Patient, unhurried. "Because the work is required. Because people deserve contracting terms and benefits. We are not charity. We are creating a reliable service that, if managed correctly, can scale and be sustainable." Mauricio's voice tightened. "We don't want to be in the business of babysitting community projects. This would change our focus." Henrique's impatience surprised him. The thing that surprised him more was that his voice carried a steadiness that felt newly earned rather than performative. "We are hiring a trained manager. We are piloting to determine feasibility. If it doesn't meet benchmarks, we stop. But I will not dismiss the idea because it makes you uncomfortable." There was a sideward look exchanged between Mauricio and Renato, an assessment of the man who had built the company by keeping decisions crisp and numbers clean. They expected caution and got conviction instead. It was small, but the shift in Henrique's posture at that moment, his refusal to let the project be sidelined, was the first public sign that his priorities had changed. Inside the meeting, a silence stretched, then folded back into the rhythm of decisions. Outside that room, the first challenge was simpler and more personal. A photo had made its way onto a co-worker's phone, Julia entering the mansion with a broom over her shoulder. At the supermarket, 2 clerks made a joke about trading up. Someone at the register said, half teasing, that she must be aiming higher now. She shrugged for the customers who asked, but the look lasted longer when co-workers whispered. Gossip mutated into rumor, an old modern disease. When the story reached someone with more appetite for spectacle, it leaked into social media. A caption insinuated that Henrique was involved with the young woman working at his house. Henrique noticed the swell of comments because someone forwarded it to the office. The post framed things in a way designed to startle a wealthy man and a working-class girl. The tone delighted in the contrast. Henrique could have dismissed it, but he felt irritation, not for himself, but for the way Julia's competence had been flattened into a headline. He had not decided to be protective. He had decided to be precise. He invited Mauricio and Renato to a presentation. Instead of walking the usual corporate line, he introduced a guest, Julia. Her arrival at the office the next day was unceremonious. She stepped into the glass building with her hands folded around a folder. The bright overhead lights made her braid look like a dark rope against a lighter world. Mauricio glanced at Henrique as if to ask whether this was a jest. Renato's posture did not change, though his lips pursed. The staff in the room whispered small, speculative comments that stopped when Julia stepped up to the projector. She did not change into a suit. She did not make an appeal. She opened her folder and began to speak in the same steady voice she used when sorting the study drawers. The first slide was a sketch of a small logo. The second had a list of practices, fair wage, training curriculum, certification, grievance process, and a scalable pricing model. Numbers followed, an attainable projection for the first year that included wages, insurance, and administrative overhead. She had consulted a teacher from her course and a local accountant. She had included quotes for uniforms, cost for first aid training, and a plan for recruiting from the neighborhoods they already served. In the room, people expected dramatics and got planning. Her language was direct, no theatrical appeals to pity. She explained how the training would reduce turnover, create predictable staffing, and open a line of clients who would pay a premium for trusted, vetted service. She mapped the risk mitigations. She highlighted the pilot's oversight plan, board reviews, quarterly reports, and clear exit criteria. Henrique watched the faces across the table, some softened in genuine interest, some painted with the habitual skepticism of people who measured value in margins. Mauricio tapped a pen. Renato lifted a question about scale. Julia answered both with a calm that left little room for condescension. Her competence reframed the room. It demanded engagement rather than performance. She had taken over the role of a person who knew what could be done and how. When a partner asked whether this was an emotional decision, meant to curry favor, Henrique did not look away. "This is not an emotional decision," he said. "We will measure results. We will have benchmarks. But I will also note that the company has a role in how it treats the people who serve private households. We are capable of organizing labor in a way that respects dignity and is profitable." Mauricio scoffed, perhaps in reflex. "You're proposing a social program with corporate funds. That's risky." Henrique's response when it came was immediate and unexpected in its force. He leaned forward. "This is a business operation. We will treat it as such. I'm not asking you for charity. We are proposing a service that fills a market need and raises the standard of employment for a sector that has none. If you cannot see the value in that, if you prefer business models that maximize extraction over fair practice, then we will document it and proceed with our criteria." The words landed in the room like a declaration and, for some, like a rebuke. There was a pause. Then Renato, cautious but reluctantly curious, asked about projected margins again. The conversation returned to numbers. The board voted to pilot the project with a clear 3-month review. The medical care payments and training budget were allocated as a line item under a new initiative. Henrique sat as if he had done nothing remarkable at all, but the people in the room who had expected a soft private indulgence had seen something else, a man putting institutional muscle behind a concept and defending it publicly. The reaction circulated, in the corridors and whispers and the social threads. The defending gesture surprised colleagues, investors, and the office rumor mill alike. The man who had always separated his private life from corporate decisions had not only crossed that line, he had made space for it within the company. For Julia, the effect of that meeting was not applause, it was responsibility. The pilot's approval meant a team to hire, a schedule to assemble, and a curriculum to finish. She was, in effect, taking over more than a cleaning shift. She now had to translate her experience and her notebook into a viable program that could be taught to others and sustained financially. The difference from her earlier life was that she would do it on terms that militated against exploitation. The line she had written, "If help is offered set terms," now governed something larger. She designed the first training day herself, scripting exercises that began with respect. How to enter someone's home without erasing its character, how to protect fragile objects, how to document hours and claims. She taught a module on dignity, how to refuse tips framed as humiliation, and how to set boundaries with employers. Training days were small miracles of tone. The kitchen at the mansion became a classroom between shifts. Rosa, the caregiver they had hired, sat in the corner and nodded. A young man named Leo, who had folded shirts at the dry cleaner, came because his sister had recommended the course. They were people whose hands had already learned many kinds of labor and whose livelihoods were fragmented and precarious. In the hour between washing and preparing a tray of tea, they learned to write receipts, to ask for references, to make a complaint without fear of losing a shift. They practiced folding a fitted sheet with proper technique and writing a clean invoice. They practiced how to present themselves to clients with a portfolio that included references, certifications, and a standard contract. The pilot's first week went better than the spreadsheets had predicted. The early clients, small offices, and a few private households carefully selected by Julia, reported fewer cancellations, clearer invoicing, and better communication. The training reduced missed appointments, and the administrative practices led to fewer disputes about hours. Within 2 months, the first payroll for the trained workers ran on time and included a small contribution to a health fund. The early success validated what the notebook had sketched. Not everything smoothed itself overnight. Gossip returned, this time with the added angle that Julia was moving into a space she had no right to. A few comments on social feeds asked whether she was ambitious enough to be dangerous. At the supermarket, a customer who liked to voice opinions said it aloud to anyone within earshot. Working for the rich is one thing, running them is another. Julia hardened at the edges, as she had learned to do. She took the comments with the same economy as a problem. We plan, we document, we demonstrate results. Evidence, she believed, would push opinion aside. Henrique watched the storm that occasionally swelled in corners of the city and chose to be present in ways that were not intrusive. He called the payroll department and added a system for direct deposit for the pilot workers. He asked human resources to oversee compliance with labor laws and insisted that contracts be written plainly in the language of all parties. Each bureaucratic action he took was an effort to remove the power of his name and render the project municipal, an institutional program rather than the whim of a wealthy employer. When she had a free evening, Julia suggested they meet at a cafe that sat on a corner where the light pooled between two buildings. It was the place where people who had been around the block in life met quietly. They sat across from each other with steamed milk between them. The conversation began, as it often had, with schedules and practical matters. They talked about the pilot's next month and the logistics of hiring an additional trainer. Both of them had reasons to pretend to be merely administrative. "You moved fast," he said after a lull, not a question. "You acted too," she replied. "You made room." He watched her face as if he were trying to read a contract written in the contours of her expression. "Do you ever worry how it will look?" She considered the question the way she considered a leak. Find its source, then fix. People will always have opinions. They will always try to turn decisions into gossip. We decide what matters by action, not by rumor. He swallowed and set his cup down. The steam made a soft noise, and for a moment they were just two people inhaling the same breath. "Do you ever think about us?" he asked, and the question lay between them not as a demand, but as an offer to be answered honestly. Julia's reply did not romanticize. She treated the question as she treated a negotiation. I think about boundaries, she said. I think about power. I think about my mother and my plans. I think about how I can keep agency even if things change. Henrique leaned back and let out a slow breath. He had rehearsed the fear that he would be seen as someone who bought affection. He had feared that his attention could be mistaken for ownership. He said quietly, I do not want to take from you what you worked for. She looked at him, and for the first time, his age and wealth and position were not simply shapes to be navigated, they were conditions to be accounted for. Then don't, she said. Invest in the work. Sign contracts. Set oversight. Let what we do be visible and binding. They spoke then of terms, clear, legal, and bound by paper. Henrique proposed seed funding that would go to rent for a small office, a trainer's salary, uniforms, and the first quarter of payroll. He suggested a board that included a representative from the workers and an independent accountant. Julia insisted that she be the program director, that she hold hiring power and manage the curriculum. She insisted on performance metrics that would be reviewed by all parties. They mapped out an exit clause that protected workers if the pilot failed, guaranteeing severance or placement assistance. They negotiated the percentage of profit that would be reinvested into the fund. When they left the cafe, the terms were written. Both of them had felt, in the act of setting edges, the tremor of something that could be called trust. The day the contract was signed was unshowy. It took place at Henrique's office, not in his home. There were lawyers and a young HR manager who had never seen a project like this and asked earnest questions about health benefits and overtime compensation. Mauricio and Renato watched. The paperwork was meticulous. Clear job descriptions, a code of conduct, a clause for collective bargaining should the workers choose it. Henrique signed as a corporate officer. Julia signed as founder of Recomeso and program director. When her pen crossed the line, there was no flourish, only the pragmatic set of a person who had negotiated for the terms she would live by. The announcement to the company was quiet but effective. A memo circulated. The pilot was under the new initiative with governance and a budget line. Some executives raised eyebrows. Some employees applauded. Journalists who had been sniffing around for a story found new angles to cover. Not a romance between unequals, but a business experiment with demonstrable outcomes. The tone of coverage shifted accordingly. The narrative moved from gossip towards scrutiny of impact. There was still a point when Henrique's defense would shock people outside the meeting room. At a gala where corporate donors and friends had gathered, an investor joked loudly about hiring practices. The room had been warmed with polite clinking of glasses. The joke landed as an attempt at levity. What's next? You'll put the help in charge, Henrique? Someone laughed. The people beside him expected him to smile and let the moment drop. He did not smile. He stood up. The room quieted because he stood and because he had never done the theatrical in public. He did not make a speech about feelings. He spoke about the pilot's benchmarks, about how labor arrangements were unsustainable, where people could be dismissed without recourse. He emphasized measured objectives and how the program created a reliable market for households who wanted vetted staff. He said plainly, people who do essential work deserve contracts and a voice at the table. The effect was immediate. Cameras whirred. People who had assumed the night would be only polished surface found themselves listening to a man who had turned attention into a principled position. The gravity of the moment was not in drama, but in the fact that he had publicly aligned the company with a project led by a woman who had once been his cleaner's daughter. For some, that alignment was unexpected enough to be called shocking. It stirred conversation and shifted perceptions in rooms that were used to different priorities. The pilot grew. The Recomeso office rented a modest storefront in a neighborhood not far from where Julia had grown up. They hired 3 trainers, including a retired home care supervisor who taught gentleness with steadiness, and a young administrative assistant who had been one of Julia's classmates. The first cohort of trainees wore new uniforms and carried binders with their names inside. On opening day, Henrique stood at the back of the room and watched as Julia walked everyone through a module on professional boundaries. Her voice carried not just instruction, but gravity. She showed them how to invoice, how to request references, how to write letters of complaint if employers crossed lines. They practiced role play, and when a trainee faltered, Julia's correction was practical, not punitive. She made space for mistakes and insisted that rectifications be documented. Rosa, the caregiver, became the pilot's night coordinator, and Leo built the scheduling app on the side. Recomeso's first clients were careful people, families who wanted ethical staff and the documentation to prove it. Word spread. Requests came from offices that wanted reliable cleaning teams. They paid a premium for the guarantee of certified workers. The small team that Julia led now had a payroll, a rotating schedule that respected Sunday as unpaid leave, and a tiny health fund. Donna Maria's progress was slow and luminous. She learned to pick up a cup without spilling it, to push herself from a seated position with a small grunt that was applause and resolve. She began to walk with a cane, then with a smaller limp, and then she warmed to weight-bearing exercises with a kind of stubborn humor. Their visits to the physiotherapy clinic became a small celebration, a slightly longer step here, a bending of a finger there. Julia sat through the sessions like a manager of hope. She took notes on techniques and taught them to Rosa and to other trainees who needed to know the correct supports for clients with similar conditions. One afternoon, while Donna Maria practiced standing, she said, in a voice threaded with both surprise and persistence, "I always thought my work was invisible." Julia knelt to adjust a strap and did not look up immediately. "It wasn't invisible," she said. "You taught people how to keep a place whole." The phrase lodged in Henrique when he overheard it later, the validation of memory, not the fulsome praise of charity. He felt again the strange tilt of being part of something that both helped and changed him. Their personal life settled into an adult intimacy that avoided cliches. They did not rush to weddings or declarations. They moved with deliberation, dinner cooked side by side when they had time, a movie watched without the formalities of a social announcement, a hand found in quiet places. They spoke about boundaries and futures. Their affection was expressed in acts. Henrique took calls from the clinic and arranged for a ramp to be built at Donna Maria's small apartment for easier visits. Julia insisted on the name Recomeço being printed on every contract and every badge. Henrique insisted on transparency in the funding. There were tests. At a neighborhood meeting about gentrification, someone accused the program of being a way to co-opt labor for profit. Julia took the mic. She did not plead. She showed the bookkeeping, the contracts, and the route to shared governance. She invited 2 trainees to speak about how the job had taught them to manage taxes and savings. Their testimony quieted more than one critic. When people asked whether the program made workers dependent, Julia explained the autonomy clause. Workers retained the right to join the program but could choose their own clients and negotiate their hours. She insisted Recomeço provide educational workshops on financial literacy. When the funding model came under scrutiny, Henrique stepped forward and explained the reinvestment clause. He did not do it for glory. He did it to anchor the project publicly. Months later, an office conversation turned into a startling moment for many. Renato had been weighing growth opportunities and assumed Henrique would return to pure metrics. Instead, Henrique asked for a meeting to present the second quarter metrics of Recomeço alongside the company's regular reports. He outlined how turnover in client households dropped by 20% where Recomeço workers were deployed, how complaints fell, and how incremental revenue was generated by the hosting clients who valued stability. He spoke of intangible returns, the company's improved reputation, and the recruitment pipeline they had created. The surprise was not that the initiative had performed. It was that Henrique had invested political capital in it. He had made the program part of the company's identity. Outside the spreadsheets, people noticed the small human changes. Neighbors who had once ignored the mansion's gate were now stopping to ask about training dates. A trainee who had been shy found confidence enough to sign up for night classes that would eventually lead to a management position. A client who had been critical in the beginning now called to recommend additional homes. Henrique's earlier reaction, stunned by the first morning, moved by a photograph turned outward, had become visible in a different register. He was changing the environment that had shaped him. Late one evening, months after the pilot's launch and after the first payroll had gone out without incident, Henrique invited Julia to the house for dinner. The dining room was lit in the warm way she had taught him to prefer. The curtains were open, and the photograph on the mantel seemed to smile with a kind of secret. He had not booked a table or announced a public gesture. It was private and deliberate. He handed her a small envelope after the meal. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was an old photograph, a family image he had kept but never displayed. He reached out and turned it around as if correcting a tilt. "I thought you should have this," he said, an odd attempt at a gift that was both simple and loaded. "You made this house something else." She accepted it without a show of sentimentality. "You helped make a place for it," she replied. There was a quiet that had nothing to do with the city outside. A ring of small domestic details, clean dishes, a kettle cooling on the stove, a folded towel, rounded them like a frame. They were 2 people who had learned to test the edges of power, and who had chosen to keep their hands visible in action rather than hidden in patronage. The wedding was small. They did not print programs or invite the corporate press. It was held at the modest training office where Recomeço had been formed, among the binders and the first set of certificates on the wall. Donna Maria sat in the front row, her cane leaning against the chair, her hand instead steady in Julia's. Rosa and Leo stood as witnesses. Mauricio attended, awkward at first, then loosening into a genuine smile. Renato gave a small, reluctant toast that praised efficiency, and in his way offered a kind of acceptance. Henrique did not make a speech about transformation. He simply spoke in a voice that had room. "We are partners in an enterprise," he said. "We promise to build work that respects the people who do it." He looked at Julia and then at the assembly of people who had become, in various ways, part of the story. Neighbors, trainees, company staff. The vow was both personal and public. They signed their names on the same sort of contract they had used to inaugurate the pilot, the paperwork of promises. People laughed at the novelty of the setting, a wedding witnessed by a board of directors and a handful of trainees. But laughter was gentle. The day was marked by real warmth rather than spectacle. A shared loaf of bread, a ring set upon a finger, the photograph that had once been sidelined now set at the center of the mantel for the ceremony. Recomeso continued to grow, not into a giant, but into something sustainable and replicable. It opened a second training site in the following year and introduced a mentorship program that paired experienced trainees with new recruits. The company incorporated Recomeso as a social enterprise, and the governance model matured into a board that included representatives of the workers, an independent civil society member, and a corporate liaison. Julia oversaw hiring and curriculum, insisted on transparent payroll, and kept the program's focus on measurable dignity rather than charity. Henrique continued to involve himself in oversight, but resisted the impulse to make unilateral decisions. He learned, as he had promised, to let governance carry the weight of choices. The public reaction to their stories softened into respect. People stopped speculating about their relationship and began to discuss metrics, wage improvements, turnover decreases, training placement numbers. The scandal that early social media posts had promised never materialized. Instead, they were part of a quiet transformation of practice in a corner of the city. Years later, the mansion felt different in small, consistent ways. Curtains open to catch morning light, a basket of fruit always on the counter, the kettle that sang like a small domestic bell. The photograph on the mantel had been reframed yet again, now clearly centered. There were new photographs alongside it. A training day class, a small group of women in uniforms holding certificates, Donna Maria with a cane but walking outdoors under a sky that seemed to belong to her. On a bright afternoon, Henrique sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and his hands folded. Julia came in from a training session and placed a folder on the table. Inside was a report, numbers that showed growth, testimonials from workers, contracts signed. She sat opposite him and did not ask for praise. She asked for the small things that continued to matter: approval for an additional trainer, permission to pilot night shifts that would allow workers with children to balance schedules. He looked at her and saw the same pragmatic resolve he had seen in that first week when she had smoothed a photograph's glass. He thought about the way their lives had entwined not through rescue but through repeated acts that respected boundaries. Contracts signed, clinics booked, terms insisted upon. He felt lightness in the knowledge that the little decisions had led to a different life. When the sun moved across the windows and painted the parquet with a familiar gold, he asked quietly, "Do you remember when you first opened the curtains?" She smiled, thinking of the moment that had shifted everything. "I remember when I first turned that frame," she said. "You noticed." He nodded. "You taught me to notice." They sat in the light, two people who had learned to make each other more than the assumptions around them. Outside the mansion, people kept their own lives and their own urgent business. Inside, work, cleaning, training, tending, had become a bridge between lives that might otherwise have passed without recognition. If the story of a young woman who filled a shift to protect her mother changed the course of a life, it was not because wealth bowed to compassion in a single cinematic moment. It was because attention, respect, and practical action were repeated day after day, and because both of them, in different ways, chose to bind their efforts with clear terms. The shock that once rippled through rooms had been replaced with a steadier surprise. Institutions, when nudged, can bend toward dignity when people insist on the terms that preserve it. If you like this story of second chances and quiet courage, subscribe for more true-to-life tales of people who change their world one careful choice at a time.